Well, I never was able to take classes from Hugh Nibley. Several of my very good friends on the internet have been discussing and telling me what a joy, how enjoyable it was to be in his class. Well, I have several hundred tapes of his, though. I own just lots and lots of his talk tapes, and I've listened to them. So indirectly, I say I've participated in Hugh Nibley's class. I've at least understood the man, and I've been reading his materials and so on and so forth. Well, in the process of trying to figure out some of the difficult materials in Hugh Nibley, I've had to read it sometimes 20 times. There are some portions of his materials I've virtually memorized in order to try to understand, well, what does he mean here? What is he saying? How is that a parallel? Or how is that wrong? Why is he saying this particular thing is difficult to accept or whatever? And then I myself have gone and gathered the sources and read them myself. And then I've gone back and reread Hugh Nibley, and then it starts opening up. You say, oh, okay, wait a minute. This is why he's quoting this particular scholar. And this is why he says this particular scholar is not as good as this one, and this idea is right, and this idea can make sense from a certain point of view, and so on and so forth. I'm doing the same thing with calculus. I've never had a formal calculus class, but there's plenty of self-help books out there to study derivatives and the antiderivative and functions and the summation series and all that. So as I slowly make my way through these self-help calculus books, and I'm studying calculus and trigonometry and all that, it has become apparent to me that when I approach a mathematical problem, and I'm working through the mathematical problem, and I cannot get it, I don't understand how come that -1 keeps changing to +1, or whatever it is I'm working on, I work the problem. And then I go back through several pages before, and I work through all those problems and descriptions and understandings again, and then I work the problem again. And I work it until I understand it. Now, at this rate, I'm going to be 395 before I comprehend fully calculus. But, that's just the way it is. But it does take work. Calculus is not an easy given. And there are some people who just think it's way too hard. Well, I'm here to assure you it's not. If a dunderhead like me can actually study calculus, and I am beginning to comprehend it and utilize it and be able to get the picture, then anyone can study it. I believe it's the same with Hugh Nibley's materials. I truly do. He did not give us... See, we on the local level, we deal with the addition and subtraction and multiplication and division of life. That's as far as we go, because, quite frankly, that is as far as you have to go in order to make a decent living, to be comfortable, to raise our families, to have the automobiles we want and need, to enjoy some of the luxuries of life. Sure, it doesn't take a whole lot beyond basic mathematical skills. Hugh Nibley was giving us the calculus and the advanced calculus. Well, of course, that's going to be somewhat difficult to understand, but as I've worked my way through time and time and time again of his materials, I've come to appreciate him. I've come to understand him. Now, I know there's many who will say, oh, for Pete's sake, I am not going to waste my time studying that material. It just is not that important to me. I understand that entirely. That's perfectly fine. It was important enough, and it is important enough to me, because I've never seen such a bright light shone on the authenticity of the restoration of the gospel as I have in Hugh Nibley's writings. So for those of you who just simply won't, or can't, or don't desire to work so hard through Hugh Nibley's writings, that's not a problem, and it's not a fault. That's fine. We all have our desires. But for those of you who are really seriously curious and want to know, but you just can't give it the time, that's what these podcasts are for. I will explain as best I can in my own words, and I will select selections of writings from Hugh Nibley, but I will try to describe what on earth is he trying to say. And quite frankly, when I first read Abraham in Egypt, here, I'm turning to the preface right now. When I first read this preface, after I got done with the preface, I go, huh? I did not understand a thing. And I thought, oh my gosh, how come it is so difficult to comprehend the first 2.5 pages of this book. And then, of course, it got easier in some respects, but it got more difficult. One problem, Hugh wrote, I should call him Brother Nibley, shouldn't I? I say it affectionately when I call him by his first name. I did meet him at BYU and did a little research with him once in the BYU library for an hour or so, and I've gotten to know him very well. But Hugh was in the middle of an entire discussion of an entire range of issues by the time he wrote his book Abraham in Egypt. It is certainly not the best first book of Hugh Nibley to pick up and read. Although I will admit now, the second edition, Farms has brought out this second edition, Abraham in Egypt, and they have made it much more readable, much more eminently easy to get the gist. One, because they've introduced the subject, and they've put in, there's a whole new forward describing the materials, but they've put in all of the improvement era articles that Hugh Nibley wrote for 2.5 solid years, 1968, 69, and 70. He had already begun dealing with some issues about the book of Abraham and the facsimiles when the papyri was given back to the church in 1968. So he was already in the middle of this series of articles, so he went ahead and continued doing so. Well, his book, Abraham in Egypt, is a continuation of his discussion for 2.5 years out of the Improvement Era, the church magazine at the time, now the Ensign. So you're kind of jumping in the middle, is what I'm saying. You're jumping right into the middle of the lake, and you don't have context if you started reading Abraham in Egypt first. The beautiful thing about the second edition of the Abraham in Egypt, which Farms you can get from Farms, and which I very strongly recommend, is they have included the Improvement Era articles, so that now you have the context. In Abraham in Egypt, you have the text without the context, so to speak, if you haven't kept up with it. Now you have the text and context in the second edition, which is wonderful. And his message of the Joseph Smith Papyri, see, that was back in 1975. He researched that material for 6.5 to 7 years solid before he put that together. And so many people criticized him. They said, "What on earth are you talking about? You're not even telling us anything about the papyri." No. In the message of the Joseph Smith Papyri, he wasn't concerned about all of the papyri. He was discussing the one fragment that the critics were claiming was the original fragment of the book of Abraham. His argument was it wasn't. I know there's controversy on this issue. That's fine. I'm not going to get into that right now. What he did do in the message of the Joseph Smith Papyri, what he was doing and what he went ahead and forged ahead doing was he was analyzing what